Good morning. So today we are going to talk about Chapter 3, Colonial Society in the 18th Century. So the colonial population, indentured servants. You know what indentured servants were. Indentured servants were people mostly located in the Chesapeake region. So obviously those are the farming communities where the plantations are. So that's where we need the labor. Three-fourths of the Chesapeake immigrants in the 17th century were indentured servants, and that's where they were mostly all located. If you were coming from Europe, you were most likely going to end up in the southern Chesapeake region. They served for about 4 to 5 years of labor in exchange for a passage to the Americas. So they were like hired work. And some of the factors that promoted indentured servants to come to the Americas, some of the reasons why we have indentured servants, is number one, because of the native population. They were not good laborers, not because they were lazy, but because of the situation. Number one, they mostly all died from disease like smallpox. Remember, smallpox killed 90% of the Mayans. And they would run away. This is their land. They know it. So obviously they would just escape their captors. Number two was a head right system. Remember, the king he was trying to populate the colonies because the more people you have, the more you control it. So he would offer 50 acres of land for anybody that could populate those regions. So 1 acre, remember, is about the size of a football field. So if you're rich and you want to get more land, you're going to pay people's passages, indentured servants, to come to America and populate that land. Not only do you control that land, but you're going to get free labor through indentured servants. They're going to be paying you back through that. However, there was a decline in indentured servants for two reasons. Number one, indentured servitude was not forever, ever. It was only for about 4 to 5 years. So because of that, the plantation owners knew this and they needed to find a more stable, permanent labor source. Hint, hint, this is where slavery comes in. And of course, Bacon's Rebellion. If you guys remember Bacon's Rebellion, I have always seen Bacon's Rebellion in the AP test in one way or another. So please make sure you understand it. And it's basically indentured servants rising up against the colonial governments because they feel they're not being protected. From after Bacon's Rebellion, we see a decline in indentured servitude and an increase in slavery. So if you're ever asked a question about slavery, what led to an increase in slavery, please, 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 please say indentured servants. If you're ever asked what led to a rise in slavery, please say the decline of indentured servitude. So women and family in the colonies, we have the Chesapeake colonies up north, Virginia and Maryland. There was a high birth rate for married women, so a woman would pretty much give birth every 2 years. So big families were big in the Chesapeake region. In New England, we have families are a little bit more stable than in the South. They have a lower death rate in the North because, of course, they had more technology, more doctors. There were big cities in the North. They were not as spread out as in the South, so the chances of you surviving were higher. They were very close-knit families. They were very tied together, and it was all about the family. So very, very close. And we could see that because they were very religious. Puritanism played a large role in their daily life. It wasn't like you just go to church on Sundays for an hour. No, back in the day, you would pray every day. You would go to church all day Sunday. That's why nobody worked, not even the slaves. And it was a big, big thing. Religion was a huge part of your life back then. Hence, close-knit families. Some of the similarities is there was fewer rights. Women had fewer rights than men. Of course, of course. They had many children. They had many children. For example, it was not uncommon for women to bear 7 to 8 children in each family. The beginning of slavery. Remember, 11 million Africans were forced to come to the Americas. Remember that year from the previous lesson that I told you guys, 1619. 1619 is a very important year, not only because it was the start of the House of Bridges, remember the first government in Virginia, but it was also the first year that an African slave came to the Americas. How did they get here? It was through a very, very gruesome passage called the Middle Passage. You definitely learned about this in world history. It was a very excruciating, horrible experience for Africans where literally thousands of Africans would be in large ships stacked on top of each other like in a cabinet. And it was very horrible. We're going to watch a video about this, or I encourage you guys to learn more about this later on. There was an increase in slave trade competition, so Royal African Company was no longer the only one providing slaves. Now we have a bunch of people capturing slaves from Africa, from enemy tribes and from their own, to send them to work in the Americas. Because of this, we're having more and more slaves, 11 million. The slave codes started to rise, and slave codes were meant to regulate the behavior of slaves. So obviously, if we're making this group of humans work, we're not going to treat them as humans. We're not going to treat them as equal. So how are we going to treat them as below equal? So if you're not human, you have no right to read, because we don't want you educated. We just want you to work. We don't want you to get any crazy ideas. And we do not allow marriages, because you're not people. Animals or property does not get married. So it prohibited all these stuff for African Americans. There was changing of European immigration. French, German, Irish, and Scottish began to immigrate in large numbers. So we have a huge number of French and German and Irish and Scottish come to the Americas. And these were not the traditional immigrants that we're used to. We start seeing a lot of racism and a lot of hatred towards immigrants. Yes, immigrants were hated throughout American history. The Germans mostly settled in Pennsylvania. And we have Scottish Irish settled in North Carolina, especially in the frontier. One of the famous Scottish Irish was our future president, Andrew Jackson. They were the largest groups in the 18th century, Scottish Irish. There was this thing where because they were coming in large numbers, we eventually started to do racist acts about them. We're going to learn more about them in the next couple of chapters. The colonial economies. There were some similarities between the regions. For example, no matter where you were in the 13 colonies, there was going to be some farming involved. And also trade with the natives. Yes, we didn't treat them all nice, but we did have some good trading policies, for especially the Iroquois up north. The southern economy, they were more focused on, remember, they were profitable economies. They were for money. So they were mainly focusing on growing tobacco. So they had these huge plantations. And remember, tobacco is the cash crop, where it created a lot of money for these rich plantations. But because tobacco is also very popular, not only did they grow more, but it's also a problem because it exhausts the land. So once you plant tobacco, after you harvest it, the land is pretty much ruined. It takes up a lot of the nutrients. So because of that, you can never use that land again. So the next season, you need another piece of land. Hence, you need more land. And these led to more problems, as we saw. The problems of overproduction and conflicts with the natives. Conflicts with the natives because obviously after we ruin that land the first season, the next season when we want more land, we're going to take it from the Native Americans, and that's going to cause future problems. Georgia and South Carolina planted rice. It was harsh conditions. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the plantation of rice. You're on your knees pretty much the whole day, and it's horrible. It was harsh conditions, and many whites, like indentured servants, refused to do it. Hint, hint, we're going to move towards someone that had no choice, like slaves. South Carolina focused on indigo. What's indigo? We all use indigo. If you have anything other than white, you are wearing indigo. It's pretty much dye for clothes. There was farms and plantations dominated the South, so that's why there was few cities that developed in the South. Everybody was more spread out in the southern regions because it was more about plantation, tobaccos, and all that stuff. So less cities in the South. The northern life, soil was more rocky, and it was not that great for farming. Yes, there was some farming, but not the best for farming. So farming was not the biggest thing. It had a colder climate, and it focused more on commercial economy. Commercial economy was important. What I mean by that is lumbering, like the wood, mining, fishing, and shipbuilding. Those were the big things of the north. The middle colonies were considered the breadbaskets because they fed everybody else. They were huge in farming. The rise of colonial commerce. Remember, the North was more known for commerce. The most colonies did not have specie. The reason I put specie, I basically mean gold and silver. When you see the word specie, it means gold and silver. I put this because if you ever get a primary source that says specie, you know what it is, gold and silver. Commerce was based on barter, so trading. We have a triangular trade happening with Europe, Africa, and the Americas. What I mean by Africa is the slave system. And with Europe, I mean the trading of primary sources or natural resources to Europe so that they could build it in their factories, and America harvests those primary resources. We have the British Navigation Act, which requires colonists to only trade with Britain. Remember, at this point, we're British colonies. We belong to the British. So the king doesn't want us trading with anybody else. We belong to him. So we are not going to trade with anybody else through the Navigation Acts. And hence, we didn't really care. Many colonists were all about the money. So the colonists started to smuggle with other countries. This was called smuggling. It's like the modern day version of the black market. It was not allowed, but it still happened. So trading, wheat, species, indigo, species, gold, and silver. Smuggling right here. Patterns in society. In England, most people did not own property. That was not the case in the colonists. Remember, in England, you either were rich or you died poor. That was your destiny for life. In America, land of opportunity, that's not the case. Remember the headright system. Most people did have some form of property. The plantation system in the South. It started in the Chesapeake region. Remember, Chesapeake is Virginia and Maryland. They grew tobacco, and that plantations were far from town, so they had a different government than in New England colonies. They were more independent. They pretty much did their own thing. In the plantations, of course, slavery. Most slaves lived on large plantations. The slaves, because they were kind of deprived of their culture, they started to develop a unique culture based on religion and family around the suffering that they were going through. Stonewall's Rebellion, because the slaves were suffering a lot, it doesn't mean that they just stood there and took it. Yes, they revolted. Not many of them were successful, like Stonewall's Rebellion, but they still revolted. Slaves went against their masters. For example, in South Carolina, we're going to talk about this more later on in this lesson. 100 African slaves revolted. They stole weapons. They killed many whites, and they tried to take over a town. They were tired of being slaves and being treated like bad. What was the result? Laws became more strict and to regulate slaves. So they got it even worse once they were all settled and captured again. And there was many instances of slaves resisted by running away. There's patterns in, the Puritan community. Remember, religion was a big thing back in the day. The town played a large role in the daily lives. They had daily town meetings, yearly elections, male landowning church members. Remember, if you're white male landowning, you had all the power. This was the first sense of like democracy. Yes, women and colored and Africans couldn't vote, but it was some sense of democracy. In the northern colonies of Massachusetts, a very, very religious town, we have Salem, the Salem witch trials. What was the Salem witch trials? It was a time where hysteria ran throughout Massachusetts, where people started to accuse each other of being witches and witchcraft and very religious demons controlled by the devil. The people, it's funny how the people that got accused were wealthy widows that middle ages. They went against social norms. So most of the accused were independent, which alleged Puritan, which were very independent, and they challenged the Puritan beliefs. So because they were not traditional or they were not normal, they were accused of being witches. These women that went against society. Big cities started to rise in the north, like Philadelphia, New York, 25,000 people, trading centers, new ideas emerged. So if you lived up north, you were a little bit more like open-minded. You lived in big cities, you lived close around people. There were huge inequalities. Wealthy had increased power in the church and society, just like they had back in England. And men had more power than women, of course. Surprise, surprise. There's a map of the Salem witch trials. The triangles is the number of people accused. If you see, they live a little bit outside. This is a Salem village. These women that were accused lived a little bit more outside of the city, so they were not in the center. And they were accused because they were different. If you were different in this religion, that was bad. You were accused of being a witch. The Awakening and Enlightenment. We have tensions between Protestants and Catholics rising. In Rhode Island, Jews could worship freely in complete religious tolerance. Remember, Rhode Island was our first non-religious established colony. We have westward expansion, which led to a decrease in the power of the church. The Great Awakening happens during this time. You guys remember this from world history. Everyone can develop a new relationship with God. You don't have to just be rich. Not only the rich get saved. We have George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. They believed in the new light versus the old light, so a more moderate form of religion. We have new sections of branches emerge or division within the church, so more inclusive. More people are welcome to the church. More people are allowed to worship. We also, at the same time of the Great Awakening, we have the Enlightenment. Remember, people moving away from religion. Yes, we have religion changing, but we also have people moving away from religion, especially because they're more spread out, westward expansion. We're moving away from the church. The reason is they was not based on faith, but more on knowledge. More science started to develop, hence more